everyone. So for our presentation, we chose the TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
So to start off, Adichie grew up in Nigeria, and this is really important because it drives the narrative in The Danger of a Single Story, and her experience helps to convey her overall point. She's the author of novels such as The Purple Hibiscus, you may have heard of it before, Half of a Yellow Sun. Her works have appeared in various notable publications, and The Danger of a Single Story is one of the most viewed TED Talks of all time. So the overarching theme pertains to the idea that defining a person or culture by a single point of view can prevent from full understanding of the truth. So there are limitations to seeing something through one specific lens. And in order to prevent this phenomenon from happening, Adichie calls the audience to confront and attempt to overcome internal biases, break down stereotypes, and acknowledge that there are two sides to every story, which we will talk about a little bit later.
Looking at some terms and language used at her speech, the first one is African authenticity. Her professor tells her that her characters aren't authentically African. And what he means by this is that in her stories, her characters are like him, professors, middle class, own a car. And to his mind, that's not what authentic Africans should be. They should be starving, living in villages and huts. So we see that's one example of one-sided stories is that perception. Another word she uses is Nakali. So this means to be greater than another, and this word ties into power. And in power, in this case, she is talking about the ability to tell another person's story, but also making that story the main one people think about. So we will talk more about this with our symbolism, but basically it's like the power that someone has to be able to tell your story, everyone to think that way of it. Now, her final thing she uses is what if. She uses this at the end of her speech as a way to question what would happen if they understood this. So what if my roommate knew the story of my family in Nigeria? What if my roommate understood this or that? And how would knowing those stories shape her understanding of Africa and Nigeria in this case? Now, moving on to symbolism.
So Adichie uses a lot of symbolism throughout her speech, and she kind of uses the imagery along with that to drive her story. She begins her speech talking about children's books and how the ones that she read when she was little, primarily being American and British literature, really shaped her storytelling as she grew up in her writing. And it also talks about how easily impressionable we are as children. Moving on to university, she tells about her roommate and how her roommate really only had one view of Nigeria and one understanding of it. So she uses that to be representative of anyone blinded by the single narrative that they choose. She talks a lot about media and the power that it holds, and how agendas are also often pushed or the narratives are altered in that, and specifically how power is really longed for, and that this desire for power is what creates a story and then actually creates its legacy and how it's carried on through time. To carry on through that, this fear of control and fear of power is often what is used to flatten narratives and only make room for one side of the story. But she mentions that when we kind of regain the unity in that and seek justice by hearing both sides of the story, we regain a kind of paradise. And she really reiterates that throughout the end of her speech. We wanted to connect this speech throughout different course texts that we read throughout the semester. So we kind of see a continuing theme of only knowing a suppressed narrative or one side of the story and then coming to terms with it later on through different authors' lives, or at least bringing light to another side of the story. So we see that in Passage to Ararat, where Arlen only knows his father's side and then comes to terms with it on his own in his adult life. We see that in Way to Rainy Mountain with the way that Momaday actually delivers the story by telling the personal narrative, a historical viewpoint, and then the actual legends that go along with the Kiowa people. And then finally with Citizen, we are able to be taken into the first person point of view of these microaggressions instead of just what Western media tends to portray. We also learned that in a separate article that we researched talking about MLK and the narrative of him, that it's important to look at not just a limited single person view of a story or event, but to acknowledge the fact that it's a collective of multiple people and experiences coming together.
So going into research to support this theme of inaccurate conclusions and decisions made off of a single story, in the book Mirror to the Church by Katongole, he explores the root of the Rwandan genocide. So when the Belgian settlers came into Rwanda, they interpreted the African context through their Belgian lens, and as a result, established hierarchies between the Hutu and Tutsi tribes. And this resulted in war because prior, the Hutu and Tutsi lived in harmony and skin color did not differentiate them from each other. And more recently, Renee Bach, a student that graduated from high school with no medical background, started a NGO called Serving His Children in Uganda. And she hired doctors and nurses under her care. And because of her malpractice, over 100 children died. And she published photos of malnourished children receiving care on her blog and was funded by wealthy churches in the US. So this instance shines a light on the single story of Africa often portrayed in the US that results in white saviorism and depiction of Africans as starving and in need of help.
So looking at some techniques, she uses inner speech to help drive home her points. The first one she used quite a bit. She was taking short pauses after hitting key points to let me or others in the audience really think about that point a little more before we move on to our next topic. Now, the last thing she did, which really helped me understand it more and thought was a great job, was when telling a story about her life or her books, it was a lighthearted feel, such as telling a joke about the American Psycho. But then once she wanted to use that story and drive home a point, her tone suddenly got more serious. And as an audience member, you could tell the room just got quiet and we were all focused in again. And it really helped drive her points home and made them stick more. So I thought it was a very good job on her part.
Awesome. And then looking at our key takeaways, one of the quotes that she had in her TED Talk was, when we reject a single story, we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain that kind of paradise that was mentioned in our key terms. It's also important to realize that all stories matter, that everybody has a voice to be heard. It's also important to look at, when we put people in this box of a single story, we take away that dignity and we don't allow them to have that voice that they deserve to have. There is also a tendency to recognize the ways that we are different rather than ways that we are similar and come together as a community. We also have a way of making one story the only story, and obviously there's a lot of different sides that come into stories. And then finally, I'll leave you with this quote from Adachi. How we create a single story is showing one person as one thing, and it's only as that one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. Our conclusion and our big idea is defining a person or culture by a single point of view can prevent from the full understanding of the whole truth. This is seen in the scenarios of the Rwandan genocide and also through the white saviorism in the African context. Our call to actions for us as students and for our classmates is to read from authors who have different walks of life, step out of our comfortability, and be aware of the biases that you hold. Think and be sure to think before you say or do. Thanks so much for listening to our presentation, and here's our works cited page.